Welcome to the tutorial for the Rodmell Pinafore. I'm going to start simply with some bits and bobs. We're going to start with the ties. So you'll need 2 of these cut to the length for your size, and as you can see there's a little sort of snake's tongue out of the end. So I'm going to bag out the end of my tie. I'm not going to bag the whole thing out because it's so fiddly trying to turn these through. So centimetre seam allowance, I'm just going to go from the fold to the point, and then I'm going to, with my needle in, pivot and do just 1 stitch, cut across the corner, and then I'm going to stitch again centimetre away for about 15 centimetres or so. Here we go. Now I'm going to trim it down, cut the corners off so that I can turn it through. You can see that 1 stitch look going across. It just gives a tiny little bit more space in the point for those bits of fabric. So just going to trim these down a bit so that I can turn it through to the point, and then I'm just going to turn that little bit through. Like I say, it's so tiresome doing the whole thing and I find it really fiddly, so for my hands this is a bit of a halfway house. I do think it looks neater when it's stitched and bagged through for the ends anyway, so tease that point out a little bit. A knitting needle's a good thing to do that with. Right, I shall do a bit more teasing of the point later. Let's show you the next step. So now the remaining tie, I'm just going to press up the 1 centimetre seam allowance on both sides, and then I can just place them together like so, and then just stitch directly on top on the outside, which is a much easier way to seal it up. I'm going to use a top stitch thread for this. You don't have to do any top stitching on any of it with a special top stitch thread if you don't want to, but I think it looks quite nice on this style. So if you think the order of construction's a little bit odd on this, it's mainly to try and minimise changing your thread going between the top stitch and the regular thread. Ideally, if you've got more than 1 machine, then you have 1 machine threaded up with your top stitch and 1 with your regular thread, which is ultimately the simplest way. So there you go, you can see that's 1 tie done. So next we're going to prep the side panel. This is just a tiny little extension to the back side seam. So you'll have this lovely shape here. You should have 2 to cut. There we go, and you'll see there's a notch to match to the side seam there, and I'm going to use this smaller edge which the tie fits into. So these are right sides together. I know you can't tell very well on this fabric. It's just a cotton canvas, a soft cotton canvas, which is really nice for this purpose. So basically you just want to sit that tie 1 centimetre up, because that's your seam allowance for the bottom there, and lay your other side panel over the top. Give that a quick pin. Centimetre seam allowance all the way around this edge. Let's go. So make sure the tie isn't under your stitching as you go, especially along that bottom panel. Needle in, pivot at the corners. And back tack to finish. There we go. So again, just trimming down and grade as much as you want to. Again, this isn't a terribly thick cotton canvas actually, so I am going to grade a bit, especially around where this tie is. I'm going to grade both sides of the panel around the tie so we don't get 4 layers, but the rest of it I'm going to leave. So you just need to roll out these seams now and give it a press. There we go, one press seam, side seam panel. So next prep job is the pockets. You'll notice you've got two different sizes. So this bigger one is for sizes 14 to 30 and this smaller one is for 6 to 12. I've got my notch here where I'm going to fold over. And you'll notice obviously this one's got size gradings too. So we're going to take this top pocket, we're going to fold over a centimetre seam allowance at the top and give it a press. And then we're going to fold it down to those notch lines that I've put in, which are the fold lines, and give it another press. There we go. Now I'm going to do a little bag out of this top. You don't have to, you can just fold them in and stitch them on, but this is a little way to elevate your sewing skills maybe. So there we go, I've just folded it over. I'm going to trim and grade a little bit so it's not too bulky at the top of the pocket. And then fold it back over. Turn it through, get those corners as crisp as you can. Give them a little bit of encouragement there. And then we're going to turn the rest of the seam allowance over and give it a press. I'm not going to bother overlocking or finishing this raw edge as it's going to be in the pocket. And because I've taken the time to bag out the top, I don't think it needs it really. So there we go. And this line now is going to be top stitched. I'm top stitching from the right side of my pocket because my top stitch thread is on the top of my machine. If you have it on the bobbin, then obviously you can do it from the other side. There we go. Done. Okay, so let's talk about pocket placement now. Here's my back skirt panel. You can see obviously there are other notches that I need to mark on here, but these are for my pocket placement. So you've got size 6 to 8, 10 to 12, 14 to 22 and 24 to 30. I'm going to follow this one, 14 to 22, because I'm making a 16 today, and I'm just using a regular graphite pencil to mark my spots. This will wash out. I think it shows up better on the cameras as well than chalk, so just a little point of reference. Don't get too hung up about it having to absolutely be spot on meeting those points, but that's the guideline. Now I'm pushing pins through that spot so I can mark them on the other side, get them as exact as possible. Turn it over. I'm just marking a spot where those pins are poking through. There we go, that's basically the placement done. So now we're going to grab a pocket and find our little dots. Let's separate these two. Again, you want to mark those on the right side of the fabric because that's where your pocket's going. So here we go, let's trim that little straggler before we start. And just aligning to those points, looks like it comes just inside, which is fine. Pop some pins in just to kind of stabilise it while you're stitching. Try and keep it as parallel to this line as possible. It does curve in a little at the top. Now we're going to do some top stitching. Again, you can get as fancy as you want with your top stitching on your pockets. You can do lovely designs on the pockets before you even stitch them on. It's entirely up to you. But I'm using my top stitch thread again here. I'm using a stitch length of 3.5 for my top stitching because it's got to go through sort of 3 or 4 layers of this cotton canvas. So I don't want it to be too short, and I think the scale works nicely with this style. So it's quite sort of chunky and workwear looking. I'm doing 3 little stitches across the top there. Then I'm going to turn and pivot and come all the way down again and follow the line I've just stitched. Needle in, nice pivot, off we go. As much as I love the look of top stitching, I do not enjoy doing it. So you'll discover that my top stitching is not 100%. There we go. It's good enough for me. Give it a press and you're done. So now we're going to do some darts, but we're also going to mark this little split in the front. So here we go. This is my pattern. As you'll see, there's the dart placement I followed for 16. I've put a little dot for the apex and I've marked little snips for the wider edge. This is the slit, but it needs to be on this side. So you want to mark this, the right size for the one that you're making, on the right side of the right front bodice. So again, I've marked it in graphite pencil so it will wash out, but we'll be stitching over it anyway. So let's put these darts in. Stitching from the wide end to the point as usual. Trim off any ends, and I'm going to lay that over the ham and give it a little press, pressing that seam allowance down. So now we're just going to do the centre front seams on the bodice. Here's my front. So right sides together. Couple of pins in, and it's a centimetre down the front. Also, you can do your back seam at this point too. So right sides together, you've got a little notch there. Let's do, oh, one pin in. So we'll put that pin in there and stitch a centimetre down again. So there we go, we're both are stitched, and I'm going to overlock the raw edges. You can zigzag or finish however you choose. They're both done. And then I'm just going to do a top stitch on both the centre front and the centre back, which basically means pressing that seam allowance to one side underneath and then stitching on top so that you're stitching through your seam allowance and the outer fabric at the same time. Oh, give that a little bit of encouragement. There we go. So again, I've got my top stitch thread on and I've changed my stitch size. There you go. So do that on your front and back seams. So now we're going to do the shoulder seams. Another simple one. Fronts and backs together. Look, you can see the top stitching on the front and the back there. Match your shoulder seams. Stitch a centimetre seam allowance. I've given them an overlock as well. And I'm going to press these to the back, towards the back panel. And again, give them a little top stitch. There we go. Trim a few bits off, starting to look like a bodice now. So now we're going to prep this neck facing. You should have a back neck facing and a front neck facing. These are cut on the fold. I haven't interfaced these because I don't want it to be rock hard. I want it to be still have some movement in it, and the fabric itself is thick enough to do that, I think. So I've notched to mark the centre front and centre back of the neck. I'm going to stitch them both together on the edges there, and then this is my back, this is my front. I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the front on this. Okay, seam allowance is pressed. Now I'm going to overlock around the outside edge. You can neaten it however you choose. You could fold it in and stitch it down, but again it can get a bit bulky. Okay, so let's put this facing on. Now find the front. There we go, slightly more scooped on the front. Match that notch we put in for the centre front with the seam down the centre front. These seams on the shoulders should nest really lovely because you've pressed the seam allowances in opposite directions. So a nice pin there, pin at the centre back, and as many pins as you need in between. Centimetre seam allowance all the way around. There we go. Let's take the pins out, and then we just need to snip in and trim off as much of those seamy bits as possible. Try and keep it as bulk free as we can, and then snipping in carefully to your stitching. And then you want to trim down your facing side to about half. Okay, so when you've done that all the way around, then you want to fold your facing over your seam allowance and stitch very close to the fold there. I'm just using an ordinary thread again, just to understitch. Really lovely way of creating a really nice crisp neckline. Okay, we've stitched round, and we're going to fold it out onto the wrong side now, and we're going to give that a press. Lovely, that makes a big difference. So now I'm going to pin this outer sort of leaf edge to the bodice. Just to secure it down while I'm stitching. In a moment, I'm going to use top stitching thread to stitch the whole of the facing down. I'm going to do it from this side, so I'll be following the fabric from underneath. If you find this too tricky, you can either draw it on before you start, or you could use the top stitch thread in your bobbin again and do it from the other side. It's up to you. Again, I just think it's a nice way to finish the neckline there. Take the pins out, and I'll be giving this another little press. Another little extra that I quite liked on this design was to top stitch the darts. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to follow as if I'm understitching, and then I'm going to do a couple of stitches across like I did with the pockets when I get to the dart apex, and then I'm going to carry on back parallel to that line. So 3 stitches as I did for the pockets, and then I'm going back following that original line and back to the side seam. There you go. Let's go with these skirt panels now. So these are my backs, my lovely chunky top stitching there. Gives it a good utility wear look. So there's some notches down the back there that you want to match. Right sides together. And match the notches where you can. And a centimetre down the back. Here we go, centimetre seam allowance. I'm going to overlock it. Lovely. And then it's pressing it to one side again. The same side as you did the bodice on the back. Give it a press. There we go. Oh, sorry, my iron has dribbled. This is my front panel. You can tell because it's got the jaunty angle of the pocket. This is my other front, which is slightly straighter. Again, notches, match those up, stitch down from the top, centimetre seam allowance, and I'm going to overlock. Fabulous. So again, I'm pressing this seam allowance to one side, and it needs to be the same side that you've done for the front, the top front bodice. So now we're going to put the facing on this front edge here. This is a strip, should be 7 centimetres wide. And again, centimetre seam allowance, stitch it to the centre front, right sides together. I'm going to press that seam allowance onto the facing, and then I'm going to understitch Again, just using my regular thread here. There we go, nicely understitched. Give it a lovely press when you've folded it back. I'm going to bag out this bottom corner. This is my hem, and where it matches, I'm going to fold back that centimetre seam allowance on my facing, and I'm going to pin it to my skirt and just stitch that piece a centimetre up. This is just going to bag that little corner out, and it gives it a really nice neat finish. Trim away any extra. Fold it through. Let's give that a little trim off. Try and get as nice a point as possible. Lovely. So yeah, so we're going to be pressing this down, and I'm also going to press under that 1 centimetre seam allowance there. So now I'm going to top stitch all these bits that I've just done. So this seam down the centre back, just doing it once. You can do it twice, you can do whatever you want, 3 times, make it as fancy as you like. And this is the front panel, the centre front. I'm going to stitch that as well. Lovely. And then this facing, you can see I've overlocked this bottom bit here a little bit as well, just because it neatens it before I stitch up this facing. A few pins in, again just to hold it in place, and I'm going to be using my top stitch thread just to stitch that down. So again, I'm going to be doing it on the right side, but if you're unsure, you can always use the top stitch thread on your bobbin and do it from the other side. There we go. Okay, so we're going to pop this skirt onto the bodice. Here's my bodice. That's my front skirt. So I'm going to be placing right side skirt to right side bodice. Match those seams up. Pop a pin in. Now there should be a centimetre overlap here, because that's where we're going to stitch our little side seam extension on in a little while. It will go on there, so we need to make sure we've left that centimetre free. Stitch along centimetre seam allowance as usual. Great. Those seams match nicely. Give it an overlock. Lovely. That looks nice and neat. So I'm going to give that a little press before I move on to the back. Here's my back, nicely joined. So right sides together, back bodice to back skirt, match up those centre backs. And these should match perfectly. Stitch a centimetre. Lovely. And then I'm going to finish it with an overlock as I did before and give it a press. Lovely, that's looking nice and neat. Okay, so now we're going to do this little slip facing. That's where I've drawn it on, and this is my little facing piece. Looks like that on the pattern. Try not to lose it, pin it to your other pieces. I've drawn the slit on this piece as well, and you can see I've interfaced it just with a medium interfacing to match the weight of the fabric, because this bit will get the wear and tear. So make sure this seam is out the way, and we're just going to stitch it on for now. I'm not going to turn it all through and top stitch it and things, because I want to top stitch my waistline as well first. because then this kind of goes over the top. So pin it in place, stitch all around. I have reduced my stitch size to 1.5 centimetres, 1.5 millimetres. You may even want to go down to 1, and I would advise that you stitch around the shape more than once, just to add a bit of extra security to it. So it's going to be moved around rather a lot and pulled and tugged. So for now we're just going to secure it in place and cut the slit open. We'll come back and stitch down the facing once we've top stitched the waist. So there you go, you can see it's stitched on there, right sides together obviously, and then I'm just going to cut it open and leave it until we've done a few more steps before I turn it all through. Sorry if I'm giving anyone the vapours using these huge scissors to cut this open. I didn't think about it when I did it. It was just, they were just there. I'd advise using smaller ones. So just like a little welt pocket really, or a jetted pocket, you want to just cut into those little corners ever so carefully. There we go, and don't snip your stitching. So it'll all be pushed through in a minute. Next job. So now we've got just one piece of the skirt left to attach, which is the underskirt, so it goes underneath the top. So I'm going to unpin that, and this attaches to the back. So open it out. This is your left side back. Right sides together. You've got plenty of notches here. This one should match your waist seam. Another notch here. And there's one more down here. So starting at the top, stitch down, centimetre seam allowance. Here we go. So we just need to take these pins out. I'm going to overlock it again and press that towards the back. Next we're going to put some binding on, and I'm going to do mine in this cream. Could use any colour you want to, and I'm going to just stitch it straight on. I'm not going to pin mine. If you like to pin it or tack it, please do. So I'm going to basically go all the way around the armhole, and it's going to finish off the top of that underskirt, and then I'm going to do this armhole here all the way around there. So you've got a centimetre seam allowance, remember, so that fold wants to go on the centimetre. Stitch it all around and then fold it back like that. Here we go. Remember to ease it in around the curves. And just gently ease as you go. Okay, so that's all sewn on. Now we just need to clip in again to any curves up to the seam allowance there. Careful not to clip your stitch line. Fold it over and press it. We're going to edge stitch this or understitch, just so that it folds back nicely. Nice easy way to finish off the armholes. Not too bulky either. Could use a really nice fancy Liberty print on this, that would look lovely. There we go, so press it, and then I'm going to hand stitch mine down. Again, you could top stitch it down if you wanted to, but I'm just going to use a hand stitch for mine. So we've just got the other tie to attach now. We've got one that's attached to the panel for the side seam, but this one is going to go on like this. There we go, it matches. So centimetre seam allowance, pin it first, start at the top, make sure that dart is pointing in the right direction. And a nice back tack. There we go, that's attached. I'm going to overlock it and then give it a press. Nicely overlocked. Then I'm going to press that seam allowance towards the bodice. Now we're going to stitch the side seam on the right hand side. So this one is goes all the way down from the armhole, which we've just bound. So let's match those waistlines. Pop a pin in, right sides together obviously. Match those underarms. Stitch a centimetre all the way down from underarm to hem and overlock. There we are, it's looking really nice, isn't it? Give it a press towards the back. Now for a bit more top stitching. So I want to top stitch this seam upwards. I'm going to stitch it on the edge and then I'm going to do another row of stitching parallel to it, and then I'm going to do one row of stitching down my side seam. So there you go, you've got the two going across and one going down there at the side for that little side panel and one all the way down the side seam. So it's quite consistent. The verticals are 1 and the horizontals are 2. So now I'm going to top stitch over this facing for this opening. So we've already attached it and it's cut, if you remember, so we just need to pop it through like this, being a little bit careful. And then turn it over to the wrong side. And this is where your pre-pressed seam allowance comes into play. You didn't have to overlock round it, by the way. I just did that because this fabric was fraying a little bit. Because it's such a tiny piece, I didn't want to lose any of the seam allowance. So fold under your seam allowance neatly as you can. Give it another press, and then I'm going to follow this outside edge and the inside edge, but from the right side. I'm using my top stitch thread again. So I've made my stitch length a bit longer again. And I'm just sort of feeling through for the outside edge where that seam allowance comes to. So neatly around the inside first, just trying to add again a little bit of strength to it. And now for the outside edge, I'm just feeling through to where the edge of the seam allowance comes. Again, it just looks like a nice little feature when it's done, and this is why we've left it to the last minute, because you go over that waist seam there. Give it a press and you're done. So this is the remaining tie. This one goes onto your underskirt. So what we're going to do is press that centimetre seam allowance back all the way down. And then we're going to fold back a centimetre, and then we're overlapping. So we've got a nice square here. That's about 3 centimetres square. So I'm top stitching that front seam first. This is the folded back bit. So it's hemming the vertical edge of the underskirt. Then I am attaching in a square shaped fashion the tie to that top corner edge. Again, I'm doing it from the right side because I've got my top stitch thread on my top. I don't like to use it on the bobbin as well. I think it's very expensive to use, so I'd like to have just regular thread on my bobbin. So there we go. You can see now we've got that hem done on the edge, and then we've just stitched the tie at the top. So now all that's left is the hem. As you can see, I've overlocked all the way around. Just going to turn it up just over a centimetre, and I'm going to stitch it again from the right side. Give it a press, and that's it. You should have now, when you've trimmed off all your bits and bobs, something that looks like this. Enjoy.